Thank you all, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Today, I'm pleased to have some esteemed colleagues with me. My friend Jesse Ehrenfeld, who is an anesthesiologist, the president-elect of the American Medical Association, and the senior associate dean at the Medical College of Wisconsin, where he runs the Advancing a Healthier Wisconsin Endowment. A longtime friend, colleague, and mentor, Jeffrey Shuren, who is trained as a physician and also a lawyer. Jeff is the director of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health and has worked at the FDA in device policy for over a decade, and I think is a thought leader about how we can change the practice of medicine. I wanted to spend some time today talking about device regulation for a couple of reasons. One, during the pandemic, in Jeff's shop, the device reviewers worked from dawn till dusk. I know several of them, and I didn't hear from them often until 11 p.m. at night, because that's when they were finishing up, and it was a heroic effort, and we had diagnostic tests, not just because of the manufacturers and the distributors and the developers, but also because the reviewers who helped get it over the finish line. A long time ago, Jeff and I had cocktails, and Jeff told me that the future of medicine, and he was saying this in jest, but there's an element of truth in it, that the future of medicine is becoming a programmer. And he's right, because medical technology is going to change how we practice medicine. Medical devices and automation can do a couple things. One is what I would describe as automation of the mundane. So taking care of the tasks that all three of us are physicians that we or human labor should not be doing, like charting urine output in the hospital. That's something that could be automated. Clinical decision support is something that can help physicians practice medicine safely, more effectively, and also increase access. And then the last part is sort of automating simple diagnoses, which is something that could democratize access to care and also allow physicians to practice at the top of their license, right? There are a couple tools that have been approved in a variety of spaces, including diabetic retinopathy is the classic example. And I think that we need to think carefully about how we regulate this marketplace, how we promote innovation, and how we keep the patient and the physician at the center of medical care. And so with that, we're going to turn to my colleagues for some opening remarks, starting with Dr. Ehrenfeld.
Well, thanks, Brian, for having us today. It's really a pleasure to have this conversation. As any physician can tell you, it's a really exciting time, but a challenging time as we try to navigate this kind of new digital world. It's really impossible to predict how and how many of the digital tools that are coming forward are truly going to transform care, as you're kind of alluding to, which is the opportunity. What I know is that physicians have a critical role to play in this endeavor, and that without physician knowledge, expertise, guidance, most of these digital innovations will fail. They will not be able to achieve their most basic task of streamlining our workflows, improving patient outcomes. And this is a lesson that the industry has learned over and over and over, from electronic health records to wearable devices to a lot of these cutting-edge apps that are coming forward. Not all digital health innovations live up to their promise. AI, and I really believe this, has nearly limitless potential to change medicine, I think for the better. And as a physician, we increasingly understand the high stakes in digital health as we start to integrate all of these new forms of AI in different spaces. But it's important that we make no mistake, this is a really critical juncture. And I don't say this lightly, and that's why I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you guys today. When I look at the current developmental and implementation techniques for these new tools, AI-enabled technologies, where it can be much more difficult to understand when an algorithm is working as expected and when it is not, there is a challenge. As a community of developers, physicians, regulators, and users, we've got to ensure that we don't lose the trust or the confidence of the public in these tools that are coming to the marketplace. That is foundational. We live in a fragile world where trust in science, trust in regulated products, advice from regulators, government agencies are increasingly at risk of being discounted or entirely ignored deliberately. We cannot allow any openings in the regulatory framework or the product development life cycle to exacerbate what really has become kind of a global problem. I would also say that, in addition to being president-elect of the American Medical Association, I'm also deeply involved with AAMI, the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. I serve as co-chair of AAMI's AI committee. I spent nearly 20 years as an informaticist developer, developing tools. I'm board certified in both anesthesiology and clinical informatics. So I've led software development teams. I've done implementation work funded by NIH, DoD, industry. And most importantly, I continued to practice, most weeks in Wisconsin. And when I'm in the operating room, and I was there the other night until about 6:30, taking care of a patient who was having a complex intracranial bypass procedure that needed surgical repair, all of these data are flying at me, right? I counted 32 waveforms, some continuous parameters, data coming from the EMR. I know that machines, algorithms, apps could make me a more effective clinician, like you alluded to. There's not a day that goes by when I'm not seeing patients where I don't see opportunities where the care that I could deliver could be enhanced by some of these tools. Physicians understand that. We understand the potential for these tools to make our lives better, to make us more effective clinicians, better than anybody. And the AMA is committed to working with physicians nationally to understand what are those emerging trends, what do we need to get these technologies into the marketplace. Last fall, the AMA released findings from our latest survey on digital health trends. We've done this serially over 9 years now. Those data showed that adoption continues to increase significantly over the last 3 or 4 years. And this is true for every physician, every category, regardless of gender, age, specialty. In fact, physicians over 50 are amongst the largest areas of growth. Perhaps, surprising to everyone here and those listening online, despite a lot of questions about AI development regulation, AMA surveys show that 1 in 5 US physicians are using augmented intelligence today. And that's mostly for operations, back-end work. 2 in 5 plan to adopt it in the next year. So there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of growth, but despite all of that, there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction and the regulatory framework for AI. We agree wholeheartedly with the FDA that the existing regulatory paradigm for hardware devices is not well suited to regulate these tools. And we're committed to working closely, obviously, with the FDA to support efforts to create new pathways, new approaches to regulate these tools. Any regulatory framework has to make sure that only safe, clinically validated, high-quality tools enter the marketplace. We can't allow AI to introduce additional bias into the results of the algorithms that we use. To do that, we've got to make sure that we have appropriate level of transparency, explainability in terms of the tools that we're using. And that transparency, we think, should be mandated. Now, that could be through labeling or otherwise. And that's the only way that AMA sees there going to be support for appropriate coverage for high-quality, validated tools. But we do recognize that you've got to have new regulatory pathways for these tools to get into the marketplace. There's so much rapid updating happening, rapid development happening, software changes. The nature of software as a medical device compared to other hardware is just very, very different. But we've got to make sure that there's strong oversight, protection for patients. Physicians have assurances that, as we're integrating these tools into our workflows, that the devices actually work. And we've got to obviously balance strong oversight that ensures efficacy and safety while making sure that the regulatory system isn't overly burdensome to developers, entrepreneurs, manufacturers, while also thinking about how we limit liability in an appropriate way for physicians. We can't rush products into the marketplace that aren't yet demonstrating performance, that aren't mitigating bias, and there are definitely those who would like that to happen. I see a future not too far off where all of us as physicians are going to see hundreds of choices for an AI tool for a given clinical purpose. That future is not far off. I'm excited about that potential. And I certainly, as a developer and as an informaticist, I don't think I'm a dinosaur when it comes to technology. But before we integrate these tools into our workflows, there are 4 important questions that we need to answer. I'm Jewish, it's Passover, it's not those 4 questions. They're 4 different questions. Does it work, right? Just as we do for a drug, a biologic, we've got to see the clinical evidence for efficacy so that we can weigh the risks and benefits of a tool. Will insurance cover its use, right? Am I going to get reimbursed for this product? Is there a pathway for financial sustainability for a new development? Third, who's accountable if something goes wrong? And what happens if not just there's a bad outcome, but what about a data breach? Who's responsible for those issues? The less transparency we've got about a given tool, the less I can counsel my patient about the risks and benefits of my using it to help diagnose them, treat them, advance their care, the less responsibility I'm going to be able to take as a physician if there are risks. And so the issue of liability for algorithm output performance is increasingly becoming a bigger issue because we're seeing proposals to hold physicians solely liable if we're relying on the output of an algorithm. We've got to make sure that, again, that regulatory framework is there, ensures safety, limits liability exposure to those of us who are downstream, and make sure that the liability is appropriately placed with those best suited to mitigate the harms. And then the last question is, will it actually work in my practice? If these tools don't do something to improve an outcome, improve an efficiency, provide value, you got to ask yourself, why bother? So we've seen a lot of systems out there. We want safe and reliable products in the marketplace. But consumers are going to have assumptions about the regulatory framework, oversight authority for these kinds of tools that in many cases will not be correct, that will be flat out wrong. Simple questions about who's responsible for regulating these products is critical. Patients associate the FDA, an FDA-approved product, with having the protection that a respected organization has done that work up front. So I really think it's going to be increasingly important to know what's been done by the manufacturer of a product and to be updated if that calculus changes. How do we earn the trust of physicians? We need to push, I think, for clear and consistent regulatory guidance that makes sure that we have safe and effective performance. I'm excited and encouraged by the conversation today and look forward to the Q&A and the questions and the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Shuren?
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. By the way, I am a dinosaur. And so I have my AARP card. I get free donuts. You have something to look forward to later in life. I'm going to take a few minutes just to put things in context, from an FDA standpoint. And I'll preface it by saying, when you think about particularly getting to AI, nobody has the answer. If they do, they're selling you a bunch of forget it. No one does. And second is whatever we do here is not going to be perfect. There are going to be continue to be mistakes along the way. It's just too complex. So, as you heard, a regulatory framework that's out of date. Well, Congress established this framework for devices in 1976, right? Risk-based, and they set that standard of reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance, of safety and effectiveness. And to meet that standard, what you have to do depends upon the level of risk that you pose if that device fails. Put them in 3 buckets, 1, 2, 3, low risk, medium risk, moderate risk, high risk. That framework, while tweaked over the past 47 years, is essentially the same, hasn't changed much. And it was designed with the intent of hardware in mind, and was created out of concerns for safety. So it's very much front-loaded on pre-market review, right? FDA is gatekeeper keep us safe, keep the bad stuff off the market. That was the idea. And it's stage gated. So for example, if you're going to need a pivotal clinical trial, you don't run in with your trial. You're going to do bench testing. If that looks good, you can come back in the door and you may do an early feasibility study. If that looks good, come back in the door and do a pivotal clinical trial, get that approved. So you stage gate. And then out on the marketplace, you're going to make modifications, because even hardware, innovation, modifications is a lifeblood for technology. And with hardware, really innovative technologies, it may be 18 months or a little bit longer for new stuff to come through. And then it comes back in the door a lot of times to the FDA and you go all over again. Then we get to, of course, fast forward now. If we look at that framework that's in place, if you're moderate risk, even though we can ask for different evidence depending upon the kind of technology, it's the same basic approach. So say a similar approach for hearing aids and MRI scanners and knee replacement devices. Then we get to technology that's truly software. So in international parlance, we call it software as a medical device, or SAMD. If it's a component, it's software in a medical device, so SIMD. We love our acronyms. So we're talking about SAMD. And SAMD just creates a whole host of other challenges because you get rapid innovation cycles, as we well know. It can be months or weeks. And so that framework is not designed for those rapid innovation cycles. And of course, now you're connecting to other technologies. That creates other challenges for changes, right? It's a safety. You don't really know what that algorithm is doing. It's like a Betty Crocker bake-off oven. You know what you stuck in, you can see what comes out, but you don't see the magic going on inside, right? So when we talk about transparency, well, you could be transparent about performance, but pretty hard to be transparent about what's going on in there in that technology. This isn't a hardware. You can't take basic engineering, understand it, and then apply that knowledge to similar technology. Here you can't do it. You got a lot of one-offs. And now, of course, you're going to see changes that are made, and you can start to see drift in performance. So it's a moving target is what you're dealing with. And you can see drifts in the data for the input, the output, or user behavior. All of that can impact the performance at the end of the day, and those are the things we deal with. So when I came to the CDRH in fall of 2009, we were approaching SAMD like hardware and said, that's got to stop. And we decided, also as a center, we can't just be focused on safety, we got to be focused on innovation. Those are our two pillars at the end of the day. And so we spent 2010 to 2016 revisiting sort of what we do in this space. In particular, are there places where do we give the most value in the work that we do? And places where we don't provide a lot of value, maybe we should take a hands-off approach. So we sort of deregulated a lot of lower risk functions because it was better to have more innovation happen because the risk was low. We put out a series of policies around this, and then Congress put it into federal statute in 2016 in the 21st Century Cures Act. But what Congress didn't do is change how you deal with medical devices, SAMD, under the regulation. So we established a Digital Health Center of Excellence, brought in experts. In fact, we just hired a new director who comes from Oracle, Senior Vice President for Strategy and Operations in the Industry Business Unit, very much in their healthcare business, Troy Tazbaz. So brings entirely, great perspective into the center. But part of their focus was, let's think about different paradigms for SAMD technology. And so we looked at different things. One, we got to go to models that better leverage post-market data, particularly real-world evidence, because you got to constantly also keep monitoring these technologies. We test drove an approach looking at the capabilities of manufacturers, the developers. Are there things that they do that if we had confidence in, we can leverage that rather than doing the deep look under the hood for every technology that comes through? We call that pre-certification, and we put a report out just last year in September. And we had a plan out on artificial intelligence, machine learning enabled medical devices we put out in 21 that talked about some of the big actions for us to take. Let me highlight two. One of them is having good machine learning practices, community-based or consensus standards. And so we've been working with other regulators in the International Medical Device Regulators Forum on AI. And we're just starting with, can we get accord on just basic terminology? And there's a report that's been issued out of there. And we work with the UK and Canada on principles of good machine learning practices. Let's at least go from the 100,000-foot level down to the 50,000-foot level. A second big piece is on something we call predetermined change control plans. So here's the idea, and we were working on this before Congress put out legislation in the omnibus just a few months ago. Basically is the following. If you identify the changes you want to make, and you have a plan for how you'll verify and validate those changes, and those work, that's the right approach. For that, set of modifications, then we'll bless the plan. And as long as you stick with the plan, you can make those changes and not come back in the door. So that's a little bit more flexibility, and that's within the authorities we can do today. It's how far we can kind of push the envelope, and that's out there. So if we look to the future, some of the big needs, Jesse mentioned some, let me add a few others, piggyback on that. First off, there are big infrastructure needs. You need large, well-curated data sets that are representative of the intended population that technology is directed at. Because as a developer, it's very hard otherwise to get access. So you need that available so developers can design responsibly and they can evaluate responsibly. And that is something that you're going to need government and really a community approach to deal with. There's a need for test beds, too, to be able to do this in fairly safe, secure spaces in design and in evaluation as well. And there's a need for standardized tools, particularly around evaluation and design, and for international or at least national consensus-based standards. And that goes to very directed on artificial intelligence and even things as interoperability with medical devices. And a little shout out, for Amy, who put out a consensus report. So this isn't as detailed as a standard, but it's really good on the application of the ISO risk management standard to AI medical devices. And that's something that we have now turn to and incorporate and look to in our decision making. But there's a need for a lot more of it. But there are a lot of challenges in standards development, and that might be something we talk about. Two is we need the new regulatory framework, and it's something we've worked on with some folks in industry. And we'd love to see that happen, those changes in the law. Three, solutions need to be community-based. There is no one entity that can do any of this, and there are a lot of perspectives and expertise that need to be brought to bear. And fourth, I'm going to disappoint you, it's not going to be the FDA that does it all. I'm sorry. It's not feasible. It's just not feasible for us to do, and it doesn't make sense. We have to be thinking about other models. Institutions that maybe as accredited third party can do those kinds of evaluations. It's just talking to the folks over at Mayo who has set up to do that, and particularly a focus on evaluating bias in AI technologies. And look at other kind of third-party models, and then maybe the FDA focusing on the riskiest of applications might be a better approach. And then we got to think about this holistically. As Jesse noted, you're going to have a lot, you already have, but you're going to have a lot more options available and things you can pick and choose from. Well, as a clinician, no thank you. I do not want to have all this stuff thrown at me. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to use it. And it just interrupts the ability to take care. It actually becomes a problem after a while. First of all, it's got to be designed, with right usability in mind. And when you think about it, it's not as your typical hardware with a physical interface, it becomes a cognitive interface. Are we really also thinking about the cognitive impacts, the behavioral impacts of these technologies, both the good and the unintended bad consequences around that? And we are not spending enough time and attention on it. But the next is it's got to be integrated into clinical workflow, and you just can't be bombarded. So you have to think about these technologies not as a one-off, but we're better off designing the space. Finally, I'll leave you with this thought. This is absolutely essential, what's being done with SAMD for health equity. we're not going to have better access to care in this country until we drive care from healthcare facilities to where people are outside of those facilities. We call them the home setting, but that could be at work or at play. That's where we need to go. These kinds of digital technologies are really the linchpin, not just to connecting people with their providers, but the opportunities for screening and prevention and diagnosis and intervention and management. But if we don't do this right, we don't have the frameworks in place and the standards in place, we will fail at that. So there's a lot at stake to get it right. The only problem is we're probably not going to get it right for a while.
If I could just jump in on one thing, I couldn't agree more on that last point. You know, the thing that keeps me up at night actually is the crushing challenge of the diminishing healthcare workforce in our country. And, you know, we keep opening medical schools, modestly expanding graduate medical education, residency training spots, but we cannot keep up with the demand. And the only way that we get out of this problem is by redesigning our workflows for how we deliver care, and technology has to be at the center of that. And there's so many opportunities. I mean, I live in a state with a lot of rural counties where there just is not access. We see an opportunity to leverage the technologies to open up access in ways that we aren't even thinking about today, but we've got to have that framework.
Absolutely agreed. Thinking about, actually, I wanted to pivot to you, thinking about physician uptake, because you know, we're all doctors, and sometimes our profession is not the best at adopting the next stage of technology. And that's not through the fault of the profession, it's the normal response, right? Because our oath is do no harm. So we have to carefully think about taking risk. When we think about AI tools and this sort of unparsed liability between the manufacturers and the practitioners, what do you see, Jesse, as a potential solution to that?
Well, liability around these tools is a very novel and complex, and I'll say thorny issue for physicians. But if not appropriately managed, I think it actually is one of the biggest risks to clinical adoption. Because if I have a choice of using a tool that I don't know how it works and I might be held liable for an error, or not using the tool, it's a pretty easy choice, right? If you're throwing things at me. So, you know, how the regulatory structure plays out for these products is ultimately going to have a significant impact on where that liability gets placed for physicians and the end users. What we worry about at the AMA is if the regulatory bar is low for manufacturers, we think that you know, a manufacturer can prove that they met a regulatory requirement that's sort of de minimis, then who is left holding the liability bag if they can point to they met those requirements? It becomes a physician.
And we talked about the regulatory frameworks and the need for change and tying that to liability. So, you know, I was a reviewer in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, right? We were the wall, functionally, that people had to get over to get to market. And then once they got to market, it was post-market review, which was a softer hand because most of the risk was dumped in the pre-market space. And as you mentioned, Jeff, the current device regulatory framework is structured like that. And it's structured because it was written during a time when software was not really a concern. We had punch cards. We didn't have AI. It was something in a science fiction book from Isaac Asimov. And we're in a very different space now. I don't think that the 510K or PMA frameworks are going to go anywhere anytime soon. But do you think that a garden of pathways or potential alternative voluntary pathways for manufacturers could help open up this space and give the agency and product developers the space to redistribute that pre- and post-market regulatory risk?
Yeah, well, we do. And I think it goes beyond digital health in terms of the needs. But, you know, just focusing there for a moment, what we have sort of envisioned is rather than having this very much more rigid sort of cookie cutter framework, and there are flexibilities, you know, built in. We do tailor things, but we're limited in what we have to do. And sometimes there are requirements in place that you have to meet that just don't make sense. Instead of doing that, keep your standard the same, right? Reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. It's a good standard. Keep it. But how you meet that standard, we should have the flexibility to design the pathway based upon the technology, right? And so we can start to think about some different novel approaches and a better ability to leverage some of this post-market data as the conditions for staying on the market. For example, when you think about, I mentioned with AI, how you can have shifts in data sets. So it's absolutely important that you've got good monitoring going on. That is also a safety feature that you need, that you're continuing to look at. So not only can you be looking from performance not changing, you can be looking at other aspects that are informing what the performance of that technology will be. And so you give us the building blocks, but in return, it's voluntary. So you know what? If you're sort of, I'm risk averse, I don't want to try it, not sure you built it right, then stick with the pathway you have today. But you'll now have a second choice. And if we build it right, that's where you'll opt to go. And we also view if you want to change, switch, you should be able to switch. That's where we would go.
I think the other thing around that is sort of like, how does the regulator oversee the market, right? You talked about some areas where there's no regulation, like the guidance on general wellness software, for example, is an area where the FDA has chosen to exercise enforcement discretion. Jesse, you mentioned consensus standards driven by AMI. That's another pathway that the FDA has used to simplify the regulatory process. Another is the 510K third-party review program, so having an accredited body review application and then send it to the FDA for final review. And of course, having the FDA staff themselves review it. Do you think that our sort of blending of hardware and software and also the emergence of AI is going to force the FDA and Congress to permit more flexibility in how these standards are applied in these marketplaces?
Well, I honestly don't know what Congress will do. But I do think you're going to see more of a drive in terms of standards. You do need standards, and you do need standardized tools here. Those kind of benchmarks are going to be critical for developers, so they have a better understanding of what to do. And the same goes for the ability to then evaluate. One of the challenges, though, when you deal with AI is, here you're dealing with technology that's predicated on statistical models around behavior. It's not deterministic. And that's much more difficult to design a standard around and have really good acceptance criteria. So you really have to think about those standards with also maybe there are some other safety features you build in. Do you have redundancy in some cases, or over-specification, or human supervision, are all things. So it's going to have to be tailored, but this is absolutely essential. And if you do that, you're also in a position where you could better leverage trusted third parties to do assessments. And that could either be a full assessment or maybe for a piece of it. We do that now today with accredited labs who can assess a technology against a recognized standard that we have in the program. And then the confidence that when that technology is assessed against the standard, we have confidence in whether or not it was met because of the party that's doing it, because the methods they're applying in that assessment, we've also accepted, right? You set that up in front. The value is the developer has high confidence and the results are going to be accepted by the FDA, and we don't have to spend as much time because we have confidence in who did it. So you could have it for pieces, you could have it for the whole enchilada, if you will. And I think for lower risk applications, you'd probably want to move to a model like that with entities we've got standards on what we do, and you go ahead and can apply those standards in the evaluation and then make transparent the results. So then your users can make better informed decisions, when they're making selections.
That standardized consensus terminology is a really important first step for the industry to take. When we all say AI today, we all mean different things, and that's a real barrier. One activity that the AMA has taken on, which I think is helpful in that space through our CPT editorial panel, is to create an AI taxonomy that's now in an appendix as a part of the CPT code set. In that taxonomy, we tried to define levels of autonomy and have some standardization for use in coding and payment, which will ultimately become a critical thing when you think about market adoption. As I think about making sure that we're all speaking the same language, there still is a gap between where we are today around those consensus terms and standards and where we need to be to make this effective.
And Jeff, you mentioned community input and community review. Do you think that the physician community could provide input as functionally a post-market regulator for very low-risk devices? So for technology, specifically for like software that is involved, or like an add-on for an electronic health record or a wellness app, like just the very low-risk category that you don't necessarily need highly trained, highly overworked FDA product reviewer looking at?
So the answer is yes, you can be looking at the clinical community. Again, you've got to put in place, though, what are the expectations on the rules of the road if you're going to go ahead and monitor, on a particular technology. But, think about, too, in healthcare systems, you have that, ready-made access on large data sets. The problem, of course, and this becomes an issue as you think about any models where you look at the post-market, how good is the post-market today in the US to be able to do that, right? And it's not great.
Right, we definitely don't have the capability right now.
Well, we don't want to repeat the problem that we did with electronic health record incentives and adoptions, which is the following. The federal government took two paths to advance information exchange. One was focused on adopting standards, the other focused on incentivizing the technology, but the standards weren't mature enough when this happened at the time to support the level of data exchange that was expected by physicians and other clinicians across the ecosystem. The standards organizations that developed these, the health IT vendors then all kind of overpromised and underdelivered. And I think a lot more should have been done up front to manage those expectations, test, pilot those standards in real-world settings, and you could see a version of this repeating itself again if we're not careful.
Yeah, and I would actually describe electronic health record interoperability as a train wreck in motion, and that's not any one particular party's fault. Like, we've all used that, logging in, Epic doesn't necessarily work with Cerner, and Cerner doesn't necessarily work with Epic, and then there are the third sets of the litany of small electronic health records by market share. The telecom industry actually has a very different approach and always entertains people when I refer to them in the context of health IT. So they do industry-driven standards development organizations, and the FCC sits there as the market regulator for telecom and encourages industry to work together to develop a standard with a series of technical experts. We really haven't done a great job of that with electronic health records, and I think that ship already sailed. But I guess the question is, do either of you think that we could potentially do this to promote medical device interoperability?
Let me just put a point on your frustration with the electronic health record. I had a patient about 3 weeks ago who I was pre-opting for anesthesia. I diligently go through the electronic health record. I think I know what's going on. She's had a couple of procedures. I'm an anesthesiologist. I'm looking at the surgery notes. I go and I talk to the patient. Everything's fine. She goes, well, one more thing, doc. I just don't want, this surgery to end up like the last surgery. And I said, well, what happened to the last surgery? She said, well, they told me I had a cardiac arrest in the recovery room. And that was not anywhere in any of the notes that I found. It was buried in an unstructured text field in a nursing place, which was not an obvious place for me to look. So in spite of all of these dollars that we've put into development of the technology, promoting interoperability, things coming across, there still is a huge gap around the usability of finding the information that we need. I don't know what we can learn from the telecom industry, but we've got to make sure that we don't have misaligned federal incentives with billions of taxpayer dollars going to incentivize things that don't work in the real world.
And continuing with my potentially risky telecom analogy. They have the testing test bed, or they have testing beds for products. You can get an FCC declaration of conformity, and then that comes via automated testing via third parties. Jesse, do you think that that is a potential option for some of these low-risk devices and low-risk medical technology that could make would the medical community feel comfortable with that, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that real-world testing is really important. Figuring out the mechanics of how it happens, where it happens, how do we work with end users, I think is an open question, but there certainly could be merit there.
And then I think along those lines, the human factors consideration is something that we all have discussed and experienced, either as patients or as clinicians. What do both of you see as the role of human factors considerations in this new space with software as a medical device, or even more so, software interfaced with hardware?
Well, I think today it doesn't get the time and attention that it needs. A concern is that the technology is going faster, I think, than the responsible guardrails to have in place. And let me go to something that's even more ubiquitous. It's the computers, mobile platforms where people read. So if you think about the impact on our kids, it's no longer our kids, it's already an older generation who learn to read, on a computer. Quite frankly, their ability to read, to scan, and their analytical skills were impacted all by that technology than the generations before that are used to reading from books, printed pages, right? Absolutely changed the way people think. And we've seen this in the workforce in terms of what people's skill sets are. It changed, really changed. But when those technologies were introduced, nobody was looking at it. And now, of course, that's impacted society for both good and not so good. We're at the same stage here with AI, and it's true. What it means is different for different people. I'll give you what the real term is: magic pixie dust. That's what it is. Everyone is, I'm going to have AI for this and AI for that. I'm going to have AI for breakfast, right? Shredded AI, roasted AI. That's what it is. But today, what can be done, the impacts can be huge. Think about in the surgical space, where now you've got technologies being developed to help surgeons sort of identify where to even cut, right? Well, when you start doing that, anyone knows you start using programs, as much as you think you know what you're doing, you do become more reliant. And quite frankly, the people who are less good become more reliant on the technology. That's great if it elevates your game. It's a real problem if it lowers your game, right? And I think that is something that we're just not paying the attention to. And that's where I think partnerships with the clinical community and others become so important, because we've got to do those assessments. The idea of just little one-offs with individual manufacturers doing it doesn't make a lot of sense. These are community-based assessments that we need.
Right, and having that community be the clinical community is important, because at the end of the day, clinicians and patients together are going to be the ones adopting many of these tools. Some will be adopted just by patients, some will be adopted just by physicians, and some jointly. But if the clinical community is not part of that, the marketplace will end up suffering.
Yeah, I mean, human design is such a foundational aspect of safe and effective device development, and the AMA has championed for years the benefits of user-centered design in health IT. We put out years ago a set of principles around it to help guide health IT development using the painful lessons learned from EHR development. How do you reduce risk by improving productivity, enhancing patient care, trying to squeeze out administrative overload, and certainly, hearing from Jeff that the FDA considers human factor engineering is important to devices is I think that's sort of an obvious one. What I would say though is that when you come back to this concept of real-world testing, health IT tools, devices are designed and controlled testing environments. And we know that the real world use uncovers latent safety issues that have to be addressed. And so figuring out how can you harness the experience of end users in different ways for that post-implementation feedback, I think is a real novel opportunity that there's a lot of merit to thinking through.
And we also mentioned algorithms and transparency. So, I drive a 5,200-pound SUV, which thank God has traction control and all-wheel drive. But I don't know how the traction control works, right? Like I know how it functions. I know what it's supposed to do. To some degree, it's a critical safety system. I guess the other example would be the autopilot. On an airplane, the commercial airline pilot knows the performance of the autopilot, and what it does in response to certain situations, but they don't necessarily know what is entirely behind the black box. And so I guess my question for both of you is, what do you see as an appropriate level of transparency, recognizing that that may change with the product or the use?
So we can't sacrifice safety in the sake of innovation or for efficiency. And I flew into DC this morning on a 737 MAX. And if you look at the sad tale of what went wrong with the 737 MAX, the redesign, bigger engines, if you mount them in the original position, they drag on the ground, so they put them forward. That causes the nose of the plane at normal flight to go down sometimes. So they created an AI automated safety system, MCAS. That automated safety system pushes the plane's nose down under certain circumstances. What happened with the two now famous crashes is there was a sensor malfunction. The plane thought that the nose was going up because of that weight configuration with the engines and forced the planes into the ground. That autonomous safety system was not in the operating manual. The pilots received no training on this new autonomous system. We just can't allow that to happen in healthcare, and I think it's a poignant example of how we need to be very aware of what these systems are, how they may work, how they may not work, even if I don't have any way of really interpreting what's happening in the deep learning.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, you gave the example with the car. And so, yeah, I don't have to know all the inner mechanics of it. But there where I have, the hardware pieces, for me, that's easier because those are things that different companies, they're making very much the same thing. But if I told you I had a program that could, predict or diagnose whether you had COVID, let's say, based upon radiological imaging, and you had a program and you had a program, they're not necessarily the same thing. They're different, right? Your shock absorbers, that's a different story. But in this case, they're different. As it turns out, I think the Coalition for Health AI just put out a report. I raise it because they looked at like over 400 studies of AI technologies for diagnosing, predicting COVID based on radiological imaging. None of them were fit for purpose. They're out there on the market and probably all a little bit different.
So I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience or online at this point. And I do have I can say a very challenging question from online, but I think we should talk about it. It says, say a physician alone has a 50% success rate for a procedure. Then you equip that same physician with an AI assistant, so augmented practice, and they have a success rate of 60%, so an incremental improvement of 10 absolute percentage points. Then they say, when you differentiate that by population, say that augmented success rate is actually 65% for Caucasian patients, and for non-Caucasian patients, it's 50%, so perpetuates health disparity. How do you think we should handle that? Political hot potato, but an important question. It's will happen if it hasn't already happened.
Well, I think we'll see examples like that. I don't imagine that we won't, because technologies that enhance practice very well may make those disparities worse. The only way that we avoid that is being very intentional in understanding what's happening and trying to mitigate those challenges from being exacerbated at the design phase. But that requires us to actually have enough disaggregated data to see that those things are occurring, which in many cases just isn't the real world experience today.
And I would say that this actually gets to something that I think we all have discussed, which is the need for validated test beds, right? You need a diverse population. You need to test it in people, test in different backgrounds, and it can't just be a uniform population then rolled out to a diverse multicultural marketplace. So I think a lot of this actually gets to product development and making sure that product development has a diverse base upon which it is created.
Well, it's also, but the data, even if you have data for diverse populations, is the data accurate? So you do have systemic biases in data already collected that's sitting in your healthcare system, right? I mean, the data that for many years relied on from spirometry, had biases that, for people who were African American, labeled as lower lung volumes. Well, it wasn't normal. It's because people were diseased, not diagnosed, and that was the data captured. But if that's what you use as your basis for then training your AI, you could be, well, I looked at it in diverse populations. Well, yeah, but your data was biased, and now you've replicated that in your algorithm and your outputs.
And then perpetuate across the population. I think that's something that the clinical community can provide feedback on, and I think also market regulators can be aware. A second question is, it's an interesting one, what is the projected range for healthcare productivity improvements caused by AI and machine learning implementation? I have an answer, but I'll defer to you two first.
Well, sadly, healthcare labor productivity has not followed overall labor productivity trends across the last 2 decades. It's been much worse. And it's in spite of a lot of promising technology. But unfortunately, I think, most physicians, many physicians, I certainly experience technology as a burden, not an asset. We've got to flip that around if we are going to actually truly get those workforce gains. There was a tool referenced earlier, I think the first FDA-approved autonomous AI diagnostic system in the diabetic retinopathy space that is a workforce multiplier, right? So you can stick this set-top box in a primary care office, in a supermarket, and with very high precision and accuracy, it can diagnose whether somebody's got diabetic retinopathy. Well, we cannot make enough ophthalmologists to do every diabetic screening exam in the country today. There just aren't enough. There are too many diabetic patients. So if you have a tool that can figure out who needs to go see the ophthalmologist because it can do that screening, suddenly that changes the work that I need to do as an eye doctor, which is what we want to do.
And I would say that the labor productivity published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that for private community hospitals, a graph that makes many of us uncomfortable and sad, has been on average flat or slightly negative for the past 25 years. So I think we can only go up from here. And I think that there's a lot of positive potential in this space to use the highly skilled labor that we have and even moderate or less skilled labor more efficiently, right? Like the joke is you fill out the form online about your medical history, and then you go check in and you talk to someone and fill out that same form again, and then you sit down in a waiting room, and then you go back to the secondary waiting room where you get asked the same set of questions, and then finally you go see the doctor who asks you the set of questions the third time about your medical history. In that setting, just about anything we do could be more efficient for the use of highly skilled clinical labor, let alone the use of patients' time. Questions from the audience? And I also have more questions from online. Yes?
What kind of changes in laws contemplated?
So you could put in place this sort of voluntary alternative pathway. And like I said, I kind of gave some of the parameters, and you've got to put some other bells and whistles in there. But the text itself, maybe about 2 pages of legislation would deal with that.
What are the changes?
What are the changes?
Yes, contemplated.
Oh, contemplated. So one is on, for some of these lower risk technologies, we have the opportunity to look at the developer. If we've got standards and we know that developer actually does well in following them and in their plans, we don't have to look at some of that technology potentially so closely, or some of the changes being made so closely. If we've got the ability for good monitoring post-market on some of those
Changes in law.
No, the changes in law that's what I'm saying. The text itself, if you wrote out what you needed to do, it's probably maybe 2 pages. It's not a lot. Not a lot that you would have to do. Because it becomes providing the flexibility to be able to do it in practice. In COVID, we were able to use emergency use authorization authorities. They are wildly flexible. So we were able to tailor, that one authority could tailor it very differently for a test versus a ventilator, and adapt, as needed. But I can't do that under the current framework.
What is described in the 2 pages?
Was described, you want me to go into what legislative?
Pages
Yeah, so
in general.
it would be that so it would be, here's the standard, you just have it as voluntary. The FDA can design based upon, building blocks, and you can give examples of them, but you allow for the agency to then identify what different building blocks there are, and you piece them together. You used to call them Legos, right? You can have Lego sets, pieces, and depending upon which one to build, you connect them differently, depending on what you do. It's the same thing in regulation. It's the same thing.
Because the market evidentiary standard for wellness app versus a ventilator versus an intra-aortic balloon pump versus something that provides clinical decision support for diagnosing squamous cell cancer on a pathology slide, those all have a need to be necessarily safe and effective, but how you meet that standard of safety and efficacy doesn't have to have the same burden on the manufacturer and also on the clinical community in the end. Other questions? Yes.
Dr. Shuren, you described kind of how AIs can in some ways be a black box, and we do not understand kind of how they draw correlations or causation between, or if they even can draw a causal relationship between 2 phenomena. To what degree does that limit the use of AI as kind of sort of diagnostic tools in particularly, but kind of within kind of the operating room is kind of, I guess, how I'm specifically thinking about it.
It's a great question. I think it goes to then what do you do to kind of assure that that technology is doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? And you don't necessarily have to know what's going on inside to know what it does, right? And so that's where you really need to have good control on what are you training it on, what are you evaluating it against, and are there other kinds of controls or mitigations that you're putting in place to assure it's doing what it's supposed to do and you're not leading to mischief. But you don't necessarily have to know what's going on. But if you did know what's going on, that knowledge you would leverage instead. So today, if it was hardware, it was a lot of basic engineering. Well, if you know how that works and someone makes something just like it, you have a lot of understanding of what that can already do. But when it's a black box, I can't leverage that. I just don't know what the innards look like.
I think it comes down to an issue of trust, right? So I'll tell you, 3 or 4 years ago, I was at a AI medical conference somewhere, I think in Ohio, and a very enthusiastic developer came up to me and said, we've got this, we have this data set and we have an algorithm and it can diagnose colon cancer. And I said, so how does it work? How is it validated? And he's like, well, there's a lot of hand waving. And I said, so hold on. I'm going to tell Dr. Miller, you have colon cancer. We're going to take out your colon, go to the operating room, but I can't tell you why. or that we've got real evidence that this thing works, nobody's going to believe that. Nobody's going to pay for it. Nobody's going to trust it. And the developer, sort of won't actually find a market for those kinds of tools.
Dr. Ehrenfeld, I'm curious, you said this in the beginning, and I thought that it was really striking that you see a world soon where there are all these tools that a physician has in front of them to make decisions, better decisions. Where do you all see, I guess, the barriers to physicians being, I guess, better equipped to leverage these tools so that they're not like a burden the way we've had them described before? Would you say that it's a training issue largely, or would you say that maybe it's the pace of innovation?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a training issue. Has anybody read the manual for their iPhone? Right? I mean, if you have usable technology that's clinically validated, that works, that integrates in the workflow, I think it's a gimme, right? Like that's what we want. We just don't have those tools, and unfortunately, I mean, I could give you 20 examples of decision support algorithms that didn't really integrate in the workflow, that just caused me more pain when I was trying to give care to patients. We need to get out of that approach to integration of technology, and that's when I think we'll hit the sweet spot of people being excited about using these tools.
So predetermined change control plans, guidance just came out about that, very exciting. But Dr. Ehrenfeld, you talked about liability. So as part of these predetermined change control plans, are they going to help mitigate liability? I guess both from the FDA side and from a physician side?
I'm not sure that the proposal around the predetermined control change plans really changes the calculus on liability, but I think it's a space that we're going to actively follow.
I agree with that. Also, I don't want to oversell that guidance, by the way, because it tells you what to submit. It doesn't tell you how to do it right.
And I would add, I think it addresses the regulatory concern. It doesn't necessarily address the liability for the end user of the physician. That liability issue is still an issue as to whether it's upon the manufacturer, whether it's upon the clinician who is using the tool, or whether it's the clinician and potentially their employer who have purchased the tool and are using the tool jointly together.
Hello, thank you guys so much for taking the time today to talk about this. I'm going to switch gears a little bit from the questions. We've talked a lot about products that physicians can use in practice, but what about prescription software products that can then be, ordered or prescribed for, for a user at home that they can, maybe download an app or something that's been cleared by FDA, which is a really new emerging topic right now. But the problem is we're seeing is at the state level, similar to the federal level, the prescribing rules and regulations are not meant for software, and they might require a prescription for a device from a physician where maybe the manufacturer intended for a psychologist or a social worker to be able to order that device. And the FDA definition of a prescription device is actually broader than that of a drug, and that it could contemplate that a non-physician provider could order a device that's classified as a prescription device. So is there a thought in the development of the framework around that and in kind of clarifying what types of providers could order those types of prescription software products as they become more available?
Yeah, no, very good question. Generally, and this is for drugs too, typically it is you have your provider who then can go ahead and prescribe, and who can prescribe is then dictated by state law. Occasionally, this has come up as an issue of how do we deal with that in circumstances where you really need to limit who should use it. Not because in many cases, those who prescribed it may be the ones who should prescribe it, right? But in cases where you're really worried that it should not be, in anesthesia, those times where you really do need an anesthesiologist to do it versus, we were getting in a situation, are there circumstances where another kind of specialist might for certain procedures. This came up with like colonoscopy, for example. And those are much thornier and really need to be worked out with the clinical community and with the states. I would like to throw another wrinkle, though, in this. We've talked a lot about FDN technology, but at the end of the day, none of this goes anywhere if it doesn't get paid for. And that is another big challenge in the US, is payment. Those systems are still fairly opaque. You don't have a lot of predictability here. If you're making any kind of a digital technology, if you're making a digital therapeutic, and I think you just saw may have happened with Pear Therapeutics now going ahead and filing for bankruptcy.
I would add, I think part of this will be the differentiation between non-prescription versus prescription products, and that's the current parsing. I know that there's a lot of competition between clinical types, be it a nurse practitioner, physician, physician assistant, psychologist, nurse. I think that the good news on that front, it's also bad news, is that there's plenty of unmet medical need and medical care. So I think that eventually that problem will probably, to some degree, be solved by this marketplace and also state legislators.
I would also say, actually, the more interesting version of that is what do you do with the unregulated by FDA consumer-facing product space? And there's a large software company, US-based, that has a product available in Europe, not the US, that you can take a picture of your skin and it will give you a suggestion of what that lesion is. What's a consumer to do with that information? What happens when something goes wrong? The same kinds of questions that physicians want to ask about transparency, explainability, who's liable. There's a related set of questions that consumers are going to be faced with as these things flood the consumer-facing product space that I think sort of parallel very interestingly.
Right, and they will have an opportunity to engage their clinicians, particularly their primary care physician, to discuss some of these concerns and questions. I want to hit on a comment you made on payment. And it's sort of interesting when we talk about AI and payment. ChatGPT-4 is not yet a Medicare Part B provider, although I suspect someday we'll see legislation about that.
But it is doing claims review.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's already doing utilization review, and so the joke is we're sort of where we are in telehealth before the pandemic. If everyone remembers, before the pandemic, every payer, public and private, would have frankly a meltdown over the thought of telehealth. They thought about the unmet need, the massive increase in utilization and cost, and then COVID forced a pivot in a matter of 4 to 6 weeks. Most delivery systems had pivoted to remote service, and now it's considered the norm. And I think we're going to have that same debate with AI, and AI augmented service and AI driven service, where a lot of the payers are going to be very uncomfortable despite our recent lessons with telehealth. And eventually you could envision a space where there's a modifier code attached to payment specifying whether it's human driven, in person, human but remote service, say audio and video, and remote service with a remote exam, or an audio only, or whether it's automated service. And you could imagine that payers could dial up reimbursement depending upon the level of investment required, obviously with human capital being the most expensive and likely highest reimbursement.
I think it's an interesting issue, and I think a place where this is looming quickly is in diagnostic radiology, where I could envision a future not too far away where the majority of film scans, images are either primarily read or overread by a machine. I don't think that future is very distant. You could say the same thing maybe for colonoscopies, where real-time images are evaluated. Again, what's the value of the technology versus the human, who's doing what that payment framework looks like, I think is a really important but open question. The AMA has convened something called our Digital Medicine Payment Advisory Committee, which has brought together experts to try to help us think about, what do we need to change with respect to CVT, as well as the RUC process to make sure that all those things are put together in an organized fashion.
And don't think that payment will necessarily hurt or help physicians if we pay for AI, because the role of physicians will change. We think about coronary artery disease and remember the advent of CABG or open heart surgery in the 1970s. That was your primary treatment. And then the medical device industry, through a series of entrepreneurs, created the cardiac cath industry. Researchers, we had a whole series of new stents, we had a whole new interventional vascular technology, and create a whole new medical specialty, interventional cardiology. That was not a board certification option in 1980. And so the medical practice changed, but so did the medical workforce. And so I think in response to this, the medical workforce will change. The physician will always remain relevant and a key and an important part. It's just the role of that clinician is going to change with time. Other questions?
This is going back a little bit, but Dr. Shuren, you said that you don't want to oversell the predetermined change control plan, and because it doesn't tell industry how to submit the right application, it tells them what to submit. I'm curious what kind of research will go into, or kind of where you're at with next steps in terms of telling industry what they can do to get it right.
Yeah, so this is going to be a little bit of a journey as we start to have companies coming in with their going, well, here's what we would plan to do. And the easiest stuff is, well, this is how we went ahead and verified and validated the original technology, right? And depending upon the modifications that you make, a lot of the not so risky changes, if you're not changing intended use or popular, you might be able to do that, and you have much more confidence that, all right, you've already kind of done it this way before, we know it works well, these kinds of changes won't be such a big deal, and that makes it easier. It becomes more challenging when you start looking at more novel approaches, or we're going to look at technology that where the risk of drift, in the data becomes, more of an issue. The other piece is, what happens when technology, so when we deal with, decision support tools, or we're going to be, as you said, radiological images, you can do reading. What happens if the technology gets smarter than people? How do you know truth, right? So if I had a pathology-determined diagnosis, that's easier. But for a lot of things where I don't have it, where what I know to be truth is with a small t, like it may be the readings of experts. We always say, well, it's got to be as good as that. Well, if you're better than the experts, it's the experts who are going to be wrong. Your performance would look worse in that case. And so that's where it kind of flips in the other direction on how you go. So this is going to be a little bit of a journey. And the way we're thinking about it is like different levels of mitigations and sort of different stages in what you may do in verification and validation.
Well, I wanted to thank you both for coming to join us today at AEI. I think we had a great discussion and looking forward to continuing it in a future panel, perhaps on payment and AI. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.